In this video, we're going to explore the range of yellows. How much can we get in terms of dark, light, warm, cool, all in this somewhat compressed range of yellows. Got a Reaper miniature here, sort of a shaman type figure. Now I thought this was really perfect. You can see we've got some feathers here with bright yellow. The cape, more gray down and more subdued, more brown. This is another type of yellow here. This is sort of a mixed with a little bit of white to almost make it somewhat chalky. So we have some high intensity yellows. We have over here kind of an amber type of a gemstone on the end of the staff. I even have, you can see some leaves here that I've scattered around on the base. And I'll paint some of these too. So that all these different surfaces give us a chance to really kind of get to know yellows. Got a figure here. This time it's separate on a little dowel rod with a pin because we wanted to work on the base. As you can see, the dowel rod makes it relatively easy to handle. So let's get to our colors. This is the kind of deepest dark that we're going to use. It's from Reaper. It's called Brown Liner. It's a high intensity pigment, but it's not quite as thick and viscous as normal paints. It's not as watery as an ink or a wash, but it has some of that intensity. And then we move on into some of the Vallejos, some leather brown, earth and khaki. So that's kind of what we'll be doing in some of these more subdued areas. And then in the brighter yellows, got I think a rucksack tan here from Privateer Press, a deep yellow from Vallejo, an ice yellow, and an ivory. Definitely want to stay away from pure white, especially with things like yellows and reds. At least this has a tiny bit of a yellow in it, a little hint of off-white. And last but not least, again for a little more, see, this is going to shift it more towards the red. We have some vomit brown over here. When we do the glazing, there's going to be some other shades that we're going to introduce, but that will cover that in the glazing section. So we've got our miniature covered. Talked about some of the paint. Now I'll discuss the palette and the brushes that we'll use. I have the brushes arranged on the palette in 3 primary groups. First one I'll discuss are these. These are filberts. Come in a variety of sizes. About number 2 is the smallest. There's a 4. This is a 6. I think about 8 is as big as I would go. I generally work between 4 and 6. And as you can see, a large flat surface to work with, but with this tapered edge like this makes it nice for doing some blending. And also, one last little feature, see that chisel edge. That's what makes it really kind of an all-purpose brush. You can put down big layers of paint, do some blending, but with this chisel edge it lets you do that much more. This is probably one of the more economical of the filberts. This is American Painter. You can find this at most art and hobby stores. You can even get these online. Definitely a reasonable price. Now these are very reasonable priced. These are craft brushes, number 8 rounds. And I've got the original package here to show you. See, there's 10 of these in a pack. Very nice price. essentially 50 cents a brush. And when they're new, see they have a fairly nice tip on these. Lasts longer than you would think. But even once they've kind of passed their prime and they're more abused and kind of chopped up like this, they're still very usable, because you can use these on a base to really jam your paint in these really rough areas, which would be murder on your good brushes. So essentially, why do that to your good brushes when you have some distressed brushes like this, I'm sure, laying around. This leads us to our last group of brushes here. These are liner brushes. I prefer these to spotters because these long bristles, they hold a lot of water, a lot of pigment, but yet keep the fine edge. This is, again, American Painter, one of the more economical priced of the liner brushes. We've got kind of a mid-range brush here. It is a Winsor Newton. This falls about halfway in between price-wise to the American Painter and this, the real deal, the Winsor Newton. Series 7, Kolinsky Sable. You can see there's a lot of paint on the handle here. It's been used a lot because I use all these other brushes, that grunt work, the rough, down and dirty stuff. This really is saved for just the finest finishing touches. With the brushes covered, last thing I want to talk about is this palette. It's a disposable palette. Comes in a pad like this. It's a decent size, 9 by 12. It's got 40 sheets in it. And the surface is very nice. It's very resistant. Keeps your paint nice and wet. But when you're done for the day, for your session, you want to clean up. You just take the sheet, tear it off, you throw it away. It really doesn't get much easier than that for your cleanup. So now we've talked about the paint, the brushes, the palette, the miniature. I want to do a little bit of kind of a color theory exercise with you and just talk about this thing with the warm, the cool, the high saturation, the gray down. Just throw that out there before we start to work on the miniature itself. We put a few colors out on the palette to demonstrate a few little concepts here. I do a few kind of swatches of color. I'm going to start with, this is the leather brown. Now let's see what happens when we take some of the khaki, which is still essentially a yellow color. And I'm going to do kind of from darkest to lightest, like so. And this way you can kind of compare these to a few other mixes. So this is going to look, when I do the next one, it's going to look slightly more gray. Let's do another right here next to it. This is the rucksack tan. All we did was just change one of the colors, and right away, dramatic difference. The value is about the same. This is just about as light as the khaki was. But you can see color temperature wise, this is cooler than this. This is also more gray down. There's a little more white in here. So without white, a little more intensity. I'm going to try another little swatch here. This time it's going to be vomit brown, which is even more intense, more almost a yellowish. red, a little more orangey. And you can see the difference this makes. So we're kind of marching more and more towards yellow. Each of these kind of increases in intensity. This is all the same. It's kind of your anchor point here. We're changing along this end. Let's do one more set over here. And this time, we're going to go into that the ice yellow. So I'm going to set this up over here. And now create a transition. And maybe you would find it helpful to do some of these exercises yourself. Maybe as you're thinking about, well, what colors do I want for the miniature? Well, you can do some tests just like this. Now this yellow is more transparent. That's another thing you always have to factor in. I know that's a lot of people's frustration with yellows, is that they are very transparent. Which is why this miniature has been primed white and not black. So just about complete with our little light to dark right there. So see, this is all the same, and look at how this just increases. All of a sudden, each step, what we did, what we had was less and less intense. More gray down, less gray, pretty much full intensity yellow by the time we get here. Now what happens when we put some of the ivory into the yellow? You can see it even increases somewhat in intensity. What happens if we take some of that vomit brown and then start to put some of the yellow in there? Look at how it brings out the orange and intensity of the vomit brown. So you can recognize some of these two, see in the feathers, you see that a lot, and some of the vomit brown and the transitions on the cloak and on the leaves. So this is, I guess, when people think of yellow, they probably think of this. Or some of the GW yellows. This is what they think of is right here. That's yellow. Well, actually all this other stuff's yellow too. Even brown is a yellow, because it's certainly not in the green family, it's certainly not in the blues. It's a little bit towards the red, but basically red and green together make brown. Yellow is one of the primaries. So what we're doing is we're kind of mixing in some of the other primaries with it. Some of the red, some of the blue. Obviously in this case more of the red. So hopefully this little chart here, this little catalog of color variations is helpful. Now one of the colors that I'm using on the base, and there's kind of a reason for this, is this, I'll be using this Imperial purple here. And I'm going to tone it down with a little brown. I'm going to put some of this right next to some of these other colors here. Because this usually makes a very nice complement to the yellow, where the blue really contrasts with it. So that's why we're using purple on the base, because you know this, it sets off all these different shades and tones of yellow. And again, we go from gray to more and more intense. We're working in intensity down the scale here. And then finally, and your complementary color, but one that's not too intense. So look at how nice those two go together. So one of the reasons I filmed this is so that you have this as a guide. You can maybe consult this, even freeze this on the screen, whatever. So you can, but you can also do a little color chart like this. I used to have to do dozens of these in school. Hated it. But now it's kind of helpful. So armed with this color chart here, it's time to start working on our miniature. I'm going to use the colors that we had out on the palette for painting the base, for that little exercise. Got this magnetized. I got a piece of sheet metal on this empty paint jar. I'm going to actually secure it even more with some blue tack. Just like I did on the swatches. Get some of that imperial purple. And let's get this so you can see it. I'm going to paint around the leaves. Leave those exposed. These leaves are from Woodland Scenics. They're really very fragile. They're, gosh, the consistency of like a tissue. I know there's brass etched leaves. I've been having a hard time getting a hold of some of that. Eventually I might get some, try it out. But these aren't too bad. These are maple leaves. I think they also make oak leaves. But the principle is the same. You're going to have to paint your brass etched leaves just like I'm painting these. So, we pretty much got the area around the leaves covered. I'm going to shift to a somewhat smaller brush. What I want to do is think about, okay, what color do I want on these leaves? I can go a number of different directions. I can go with the tan, I can go with the rucksack tan. I can also even create a different tan by mixing, just mix that ice yellow with the brown. All of a sudden we have something that's really close to that tan. I actually like to mix a lot of colors. Don't necessarily want to have 2,000 colors out on the palette. This right here is a little bit on the dead side. So I'm going to stick with the rucksack tan, and I'm going to start somewhat lighter. I want to have some of this vomit brown handy as well. So I'm going to stir that up. So a little yellow there. So I have some more intense leaf color and some that's a little less intense. So again, more saturated here, less saturated here. Pick out a few of these leaves. You won't really see a whole lot of difference when I put this down. The leaves, they come in yellow, but they kind of assume whatever color is underneath it because they're really super translucent. And let's put down, let's get a more intense color in here. So now as those dry, I'm going to bring out some of the brown liner. And the Reaper brown liner here. Get that out on the palette. And I'm going to grab one of the washes you're going to see me use. This is Agarax Earthshade. I'll throw this out on the palette too. And use these two kind of in concert, like so. Just like we brought out the leaves on the top surface by painting the dark around them, I'm going to do the same thing, only this time much more transparently. I just want to do this while we're waiting for the other stuff to dry. You're going to also see a lot of this glazing technique when it comes to painting the miniature. It kind of comes in after the shaded base coat. There's a little bit of a preview, and you can see how in some cases I even take it away with my finger. And what's important about this base is that it creates an environment, sets a context for the miniature itself. There we go. Very quickly. That pretty much establishes all the darks around the leaves. Now on the leaves themselves, we want to do some of these veins. I'm going to pick some of the leaves on the top. Take some of this brown, mix it with the vomit brown. Get this closer so you can see it. And just start to indicate some of the veins on this leaf. Over here. This one. Might even take some of the purple. Mix that in as well. Darken the veins of the leaves down a little more. Rotate this around. So these leaves. Don't want to forget this guy over here. Can even throw in some of the brown liner to, in effect, make a bit of a shadow underneath the leaf on your marble there, or stone, whatever it may happen to be. Tiny bit of a shadow there. Mix in some of the brown. That's about as dark as we want to make those veins. We can go in the other direction. Let's take some of the deep yellow, mix that with a little bit of the ice yellow, and throw a little bit of a highlight on the ends of these leaves. So what I've done here, this is another little sort of a microcosm of the miniature. So this is on all of these color theory, like the blue and the red. That's why the base plays an important part in it, because it sort of shows you what we're going to do on the miniature itself. So that just about, that's going to pretty much conclude our work on the base. So that's all done, ready to go, and the miniature is finished. So I've got paint out on the palette, and we're ready to go. This is going to be that shaded base coat I told you about. Essentially what that is blocking in your colors to essentially eliminate all of this white primer as quickly as possible. Now I got the Imperial Purple back out on the palette again, because this essentially is most of the flesh tone right here, mixed in with a little bit of the leather brown. And I'm going to throw this down first. I'm not really going to care about staying in the lines. That's sort of what the whole shaded base coat means. You can, in these initial layers, all you're doing is just you're putting the paint down, especially in kind of more of a limited palette exercise like this, where it's just a variety of yellows. Sometimes you want to just experiment and say, well, does this work here? Does this need a little more over here? And you can do that by not getting bogged down in details right off the bat. Because, okay, so I know some people, they like to do the whole face first, and then everything else is still white around it. Well, that's fine, but you don't have the context, because this color looks fairly dark on the palette, but when it's next to what we've done, well, it's not dark anymore. And that's what this is all about, is also letting us do some wet blending. It's just get your colors out there as fast as possible. I just switched to a little bit of the earth from Reaper. Might actually do a little bit on the back of this cape. Remember, this is a somewhat more subdued, essentially working about in this range over here. This is what the filbert brush lets me do. It lets me work quickly, lets me cover all of these surfaces somewhat rapidly. Gonna let a little of the rucksack tan work its way in as I get up towards the feathers on the top of the head. The staff, just want to get rid of the white, because later we'll be doing is this. So very quickly, all of a sudden that staff has some shading. That's the shaded base coat. It's a base coat. It's nowhere near your final colors or anything of the sort, but it gives you, it's all about that contact. You can compare and contrast what's on the miniature. It's hard to just guess when it's all white. That's essentially what you're going to do, is just guess, well, let's see, how dark should I make my next color? Well, if all the lights and darks are essentially out here to start with, it takes away some of that guesswork. So I know that the feathers up top are going to be the more intense yellow, but I'm going to set the background for them by letting a little bit of this vomit brown work its way in there. Let it cascade down. So kind of in no time at all, we've already not only have all that primer taken away, we started to set the stage a little bit here. Set the stage and even done some rudimentary shading. Hence that's why I called it shaded base coat. And with these filberts, you have the option of see, there's plenty of paint on that brush. It's not a dry brush. And it was change the angle of the miniature and just drag this down. Just dragged it down. Same thing all the way down. All the way down the legs. Gonna reach into some of the tan. Do the same thing. Just carry that down. It's the same principle as what we did on the staff. Got a little bit of the ice yellow on the staff. Bring it down. The yellows on this straps on the legs here, that's going to be much more gray down. Some of the grayest colors on the entire figure. Now at the same time, the feathers and the front part of the cloak here, that's going to be the most high intensity color. Now there are times where you may set the figure aside, let a layer dry, and especially if you're working on more than one miniature at once, that kind of does it by itself. I rarely actually do one figure at a time like this start to finish. It almost never happens for me. It's just the nature of what I do. For you, that may be a whole different story. Maybe you are just going to paint one figure at a time. So in that case, you may dry it in between layers. I don't necessarily mind that the colors start to mix together, because this way they all they tie in together. They stay in the same color family, they don't wander outside the family. So I'm just gonna throw in a few touches of lighter colors. This is all gonna change when we do that glazing step. I'll talk about that more when it's time, about how the glaze is kind of a controlled wash. For now, I'm just going to focus in on this shaded base coat. You can, if you want to, you could use the smaller number 8 rounds. Now I'm kind of going after some of the lights on the feathers, on the headdress. Now I've been holding the brush down here on the end. That's really important at this stage, because you don't want to get into this. This is not about details. We're not painting in individual little things on the feathers. We're thinking globally. We're thinking overall. But it's still not a dry brush, because you can see there's plenty of paint out here. Sometimes refer to it as damp brushing. Get some of the effects of the dry brush, but just with paint that's really, really pretty wet. So you can still see I've left, even with as haphazard as this seems, we've sort of organized the colors on the miniatures already. Just with this little bit. I've decided, these are going to be light, but less intense, so look at how intense that headdress is going to be in comparison to these other parts that are nowhere near as intense. The robe here, trying to make sure that does not get too saturated too quickly. And again, saturated is this versus some of these unsaturated colors that are more grayed down. So I'm starting to reach that point where I call it quits on the shaded base coat, and then proceed to doing those washes and glazes. So what I'm going to do is let this dry, and we'll discuss that next very important part of this figure. Here's the colors that we're going to use for that glazing that I was telling you about. And as we'll see when we go through this stage, glazing, I refer to it as a very controlled wash. Most people, typically a wash is you have a bigger brush, slap it full of brown, and it gets slathered all over the whole miniature, and that's a wash. The glaze, much more targeted. We're using a much smaller brush, like a liner brush. It's seen kind of better days, but still should offer a fair amount of control. And you still have some of the brown liner out. A couple of Vallejos here. Black shade, sepia shade. We've got a few secret weapon washes here. A flesh wash. Everybody's favorite, the baby poop. Some dark sepia here. Also a ruby. Gonna use this just to make sure we have enough variety in some of our tones, and it's also for a little bit on the flesh. This is probably the most unique thing we're gonna do. I think it's one of the few, if only, videos that has an ink involved. And I got this a while back. This is really, really intense. I'm gonna use it to intensify, especially our glazes here, because remember it's all about that saturation. And hit it in a few spots on the top of the cloak, even a few places on this amber crystal. So I'm going to put these out on the palette, and that's where we start to transform our shaded base coat to something like this with all these nice rich darks. So our wash colors, glaze colors, all out on the palette. Got that yellow ink kind of segregated off to the side, because this thing, it's really intense. A little of this goes a long way. Mix some of that with the ruby. You can see what that does. Makes a nice high intensity color. Nice place to use this. That looks an awful lot like amber. So I'm gonna put some of that on our piece of amber up here. And I'm going to work this gradually. I'm not going to put it all on at once. Just a little bit here. Let it dry. Do another layer. Let that dry. Do another layer. It sounds like a lot of work, but actually 3 transparent layers, sometimes even as many as 5, take about as much time to do as 1 opaque layer. I'm going to let even more of the ruby find its way. There we go. It's the other thing that's nice about when you're using these kind of materials is that you can allow them to kind of do their own thing on the miniature. Let them blend themselves. That was kind of an introduction into what the yellow ink can do. Let's put this in with some of our other colors, see what we get. So this was the dark sepia. That's a little more of the green. This should also be somewhat gray, a little less so, a little more towards the brown. This is a much more, see, kind of a reddish. That's our sepia shade. Over here, the black. This is out here for some of these areas that need to be a little more toned down, less intense, like under here. And we can even grab this and I'm gonna put some right into that area. So right away that says, okay, that's going to be a dark. I'll mix a little more, some of the sepia with the black. Carry this down. Like so. Some more right there. I'll leave that sit. I'm going to go back to that headdress and take a tiny bit. I'm going to make sure I have some of this ruby out here just to use. We're going to take some of the high intensity ink. You can see I'm not touching this here. I don't want to affect my highlights. I want to work around that. I may even use my finger, wipe some of that away. So what we're doing is we're painting into the darks. We're leaving the lights that we established, but painting in those darks around that. So continuing, we're going to work our way up, over, and down. Leaving this as we said, the most intense of the colors, and this ink is really going to help with that. Now, I will say it's got a gloss to it. And some of the other ones also have, they leave things a little bit glossy. That's why I like to rely on my brush-on varnish, and I'll show you that when it comes time. It's a nice army painter product. Really, it takes away the shine and enriches the colors. So here I'm mixing even more of the ruby. So what we've done, all of a sudden it was just kind of a mass of light yellow. Now it has even more intensity, more shading, a little more everything. And I can still, as that dries, go back over it with subsequent layers. I'm going to leave that now to kind of work on its own, dry on its own. I'm going to grab some of this black and mix it with some of our other washes. This is again more toned down, nowhere near as intense as our yellow ink was, and that's for a reason. Alright. Now I'm going to water this down a tiny bit and do some of the stuff on the arm here. Gonna get the inside. Pull away some if I need to. And remember, you can always do more layers. Now, on the staff here, wipe away. This is somewhat watered down. And again, I'm wiping some of it away. So what we've done is enhanced. There was a little bit of this light to dark shading on that staff. Well, now there's a whole bunch more. We can do even more in subsequent layers if we want. So I'll water this down. Take a little bit of that yellow ink to intensify this sepia shade. And I'm going to put it here on this cloth that comes down. Leave that alone. I'm going to shift over towards the back. And up here, a little bit, not too much. See, I've kind of worked in more of the sepia shade and more of the, some of the baby poop there. As this moves down, I'm going to think in terms of kind of cooling that down as it gets towards the ground, so some of the black gets mixed in. Over here. Put some there, take it away. It's kind of, I like to call it adding and subtracting. Some dark under there. I'm going to go back to this black here just to get some I need some shadow here. I need some kind of form here now on what looks like the wrappings around these legs. Need some more shadow in there. Definitely need some here. So as we kind of rotate this around, it's another reason I like to have them on these pins, because just like when I have them on the empty paint jars, I can rotate this around, get an overall view of what I've been working on. don't want to lose sight of kind of the whole. Don't really want to turn this into an exercise on not metallic, so I'm just going to do some really basic stuff on that on the dagger blade. I'm not going to get too fancy with that. So I've worked around. There's an awful lot of these. The yellows here. Let's throw a little bit now on the flesh tone. That's got the ruby. Throw some black over here. Water this down, and this is going to be some of the shade color on my flesh tone. I tried to actually pick a flesh tone that was complementary to all these yellows. That's why it's more towards the purple. That's why the base has some purple in it. So I was toning down all this stuff that was so light. It's going to start to get some shadow to it. Here really needs some shadow. There we go. Same thing down in there. And don't be afraid to take your finger and remove some, or go in and do additional glazes over the top of what you've done. So more and more of the shading is established. So we kind of work our way around, just kind of picking and choosing. Now some of this, I'm going to just have to let it sit. I'm going to have to let it sit, I'm going to have to let it dry. And again, you could do more layers of glazing on top of that when it is dry. So what I'm going to do is kind of draw this part to a close. Dry that off. And we're going to start to work on some of those mid-tones. And by mid-tones, that's right here. Light, darks, mid-tones. So what we had was kind of here to here. What we put in now is more this, or this. So we're going to start here, and so we're going to start to work this way. And as we work into those highlights, that's where we start to bring out some of the detail. It's kind of the whole point of this method, is you can kind of gradually work your way into those details as you highlight, instead of just highlighting for highlight's sake. The highlights tend to generate details. So let's dry this off, and we'll get to those mid-tones. Once you're satisfied with how dark your glazes have become, now it's time to get back into what we call the middle tones. And work on the cape, work on the handle of the staff, do some on the gemstone. Also put some more lights on some areas of the headdress, the flesh. This we'll do a little bit on the blade, not much, just a little bit, and a lot of work on these leggings here. With all of that, it takes a little bit of time to work your way through this. So I've got this mostly dried out. Now again, the inks, that ink left this a little bit glossy. And here is the solution to that. This is from Army Painter. It's called Anti-Shine. And I'll throw some of it out on the palette here, where you can hopefully actually see it. Throw it right over here. Well, you can't see that. That's what really is nice about this product. It's the only one I know of that goes out clear like this. Well, it seems like every single other one goes out like Elmer's glue. It's kind of milky white, and then you have to wait for it to eventually become clear. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab one of my brushes here. It has to be a pretty clean one. Go into this, not a whole bunch. And on this area where the ink is, I know normally this is something that you would do when the miniature is all done. I'm going to do this just to kill some of the shine. Now, as we work on some of these other areas around the headdress, I'll let that dry. And hopefully that will have reduced the shininess by then. I'm going to throw a little bit here on the amber stone. So that little bit, that's all I'm going to do. And the idea is that's going to cool down the whole effect of that shininess. And again, that's Army Painter. It's the Anti-Shine. And what's great about it is that it goes on clear, stays clear, and really is a genuine matte finish. One of the things I talked about was mixing paint in with your washes. So what I've got there, some baby poop, we've got a little bit of the tan, and this makes an entirely new color, and it's one that falls right about here in our kind of value scale and intensity scale. And this looks like something good that we can use maybe on the back of this cloak here. Start up here, kind of work my way down. See, it's not too light, it's not too dark. Just trying to smooth things out a little bit. Sometimes when you do your glazes, you can get some of these little kind of stripes and streaks here. That's why we go back in with these middle tones to kind of nullify that effect. We know we're going to be doing these layers anyway, so it's not like it's any extra work. Mention a little more of the khaki. Go up here, and again, this is more of a highlight. But when we look on the palette, especially next to white, this color is not incredibly bright. It's lighter than the colors we've got down here. And some of this is going to go right here on the staff, working its way down, just like what we did here. You want to make that a little lighter. I'm going to grab some of that ice yellow. I can put that in there. Want to make sure it doesn't get too light though. And right here. So I've got this nice light to dark transition here. You could even put some designs down here. Take some darker colors up here, put your design, and could use this color down here. Maybe just some swirls, whatever. But now this part, these leggings here, this is the next thing I want to go after. I have to put some lights in here. Now you can see I'm using the number 8 round. You could certainly use a liner brush. I'm gonna switch back and forth between the two, or just to show you that yes, it's possible to use a brush of this size to do work that's relatively detailed. That's what I enjoy about these craft brushes, is that you can, there's a decent enough point here, especially when they're pretty new, to do just this sort of work. And this is kind of the top of the cloth here. You can see there's a little bit of a, I don't know if there's a gem there or not. There might be. Sometimes it's a little hard to tell. But later we're going to go in with the brown liner and solidify the darker lines. Right now what we're after are some of these lighter colors. This band on the headdress here, move it over. Work my way down. These leggings, I might actually put a little more of that yellow in there. And a few more. Some lights there. These are not necessarily the brightest highlights. I'm going to do a few there. One more here on the staff. I'm going to kind of set this on its side. Make it so you can see it. And take the brush on its side and start to pick out the lights on those leggings there. I can see that another thing I want to do is show you taking some of this, almost a color like this, these little triangle things here on the ends of the leg. And I want those to be a little bit different color, a much cooler brown. And that's where we're going to mix some of the ice yellow with that dark brown liner that I talked about earlier. So up here, this is going to definitely need an awful lot of light. I want to make sure that it doesn't get too, ironically, too yellow. It's strange to say that in a video that's all about yellows, but I want it to be a little more subtle, because I want to leave, as we've talked about many times, I want to leave the most intense, highly saturated yellows for things like the headdress and certain highlight areas of the robes. And I'm going to move over to the other leg here. And not necessarily do every single one. I want to leave a few. And when I reach the point where I think, okay, now I want to get my Winsor Newton brush and do something that maybe it's a little bit finer. I'm going to lighten up. This makes a little bit of that ice yellow. Instead of the yellow, that's the deep yellow, this is the ice yellow mixed with the khaki. So I'm going to go in here. Pick out some more edges that are going to be lighter. Very quickly, just on that dagger, on the arm here, the headdress. When you look at the palette, see, this is not, even though it looks light here, it's nowhere near as light as we can go, and that's a good thing. We really want to leave ourselves as much room to work with as possible. I want to pick out more lights on the back of the leg here. And this will stand out especially since around it are even darker colors. This little piece here, it's going to need a few lighter colors before we go back in with that really dark brown. There's a little bit of the hilt of the dagger. While I'm here, I'm going to throw a few little lighter colors on that hand, on the knuckles here. So that shows up a little bit more. So a lot of what we do at this stage is, I guess you could call it cleaning up a little bit. Any weird little artifacts that might have been created as you did some of your glazing. Because sometimes watermarks will happen. Now I'm going to actually go into some of the more intense colors again. This is the vomit brown and the deep yellow. I want to do a little bit of work on the amber here. And start to pull out some lighter colors on the headdress. Get a little more intense with the yellows, especially here. And I do apologize if things either go off camera or maybe get a little fuzzy. There's times where I need to be able to see it, or I need to be able to contort my hands to be able to get to it. As I work down towards these bottom feathers, I don't do quite as much with the highlight. I really want to keep that up towards the top. So some of the ice yellow now going to work its way in. And start to do now some very light colors. I need a few of these now that I've got this. A few go here, right on this part of the costume. Some here. Okay, the light comes down this way, and I want some of those surfaces that are pointing up to catch that light. And I look around, and if I see an area that might need something, I always kind of look around and compare. And if something either looks out of place, maybe too bright, take it down. But usually at this stage you're constantly trying to lighten things. Well, I've got some of this lighter color. Gonna do a few dots of the eyes here. And the top of the headdress. Go back to some of my bright color here. I need to do this. It goes down the side of the face. And you could keep going crazy, doing more and more and more. What I'm going to do is stop at this point and grab that brown liner, some of the dark, and put in some of these darker things that you see here. Gonna restore some of that, and that'll be our next little segment. I have some of the brown liner out here on the palette. It's a nice deep dark. It's not black though. Still has a little bit of color to it, and also it's nice and thin as opposed to that regular paint. It's thicker. You have to thin it down. This you don't have to thin down at all, which means you don't lose its intensity, its deep dark nature. Alright, so let's find some spots where we want to reinforce some darks, and that's going to be right here. This will create some definition as well. So just a few there. Make this so you can see it. The headdress here needs definition right there. A little bit of the brown liner does go kind of a long way. So along this the handle of the dagger needs some. Maybe the fingers, a little more definition. The blade certainly does. Let's turn this so you get a better shot at it. There we go. Need some spots down here, just like that, just to get a little more of the definitions on the top edge of right there. Certainly needs some darks in there on this side. Maybe even here on the bottom of the staff. See, we need some here to kind of pull out some of these individual wrappings, like right here. And this got a little wonky. We'll fix that. Along here, I need a little more definition. So what this is just about making these individual little wrappings a little less fuzzy. And the other side. So in the back here, we need to organize this a little bit. This is kind of unorganized, not really clear what's going on. So I'll make it clear. It looks like these are some holes in the cloak here. We can define those a little better. This little section here certainly needs some definition. Up here by our piece of amber, also definitely some definition, so cut that right there. Fingers. I'd also use the same brown liner to throw in the eyeballs and put a little dark on the top of the under the top side of that upper lip. Now one thing I'm going to do, I'm going to take, even though this is brown, look what happens when I mix it with the ice yellow. Now that essentially turns gray. What I can do is use that as almost like a stone type of a color here. And on some of these, see these little triangle things that are hanging down? Now we used two colors that are actually out on the palette, and yet they created an entirely different. See how that almost looks like a cool color next to all the yellows? Again, that's we set that up. And I can go even more with the ice yellow. And again, go back to the dagger here. So it looks maybe not quite like steel, maybe a little bit more like stone, like some kind of ceremonial stone dagger. But what it's done is we didn't have to go out and get some gray color. That way we used colors that were already on the palette. This is stuff we've already used elsewhere. But by mixing these two things together, we just got a whole new color entirely. Now, do the same thing on some of these other little triangles down here. Gonna treat those as little pieces of stone. I think there's some over here too. And what this does is while it's great to have yellows and lots of yellows, if it's just all the same color of yellow, it's just gonna be kind of boring, not much fun to look at. So what this does is it creates something that's still technically yellow, because guess what, we used yellow, but it has it's much cooler. Let's go back to top edge of the dagger here. So again, we were able to create a gray using brown and white, not having to go reach for something that has too much blue in it. So hopefully you can see some of the little things that I'm working on here. Pull out some light up there on the top of pieces of stone hanging down from the amber. There's going to be one more little segment after this that I'll just cover that piece of amber kind of by itself. Might even do a little sketch on the side on our piece of paper there, because that's gonna be kind of the opposite of what we're doing here. See all these cool colors we're putting in. The amber is going to be opposite. That's where we're going to be putting in more red. So I'm going to grab just a little more of the ice yellow. Here on the top of that headdress. Now time to go back the other way. Oops. She's down. Gonna go back to the brown liner. Reinforce some of those darker shapes again. Towards the end of this little dagger. Some of these little bits hanging down off the front of the costume. Gonna mix in, get some of that ruby, mix that in with the brown liner. It's gonna be more putting some darks on the flesh tone. So again, we're using colors that are already out on the palette. We didn't have to add anything. While I have that, just a couple of darker colors on that amber. And just, I know we got a little, gonna work on this some more in the next segment. I just happen to have the color out, and you can see what a dramatic difference just that little bit made. I'm going to add a little bit of some of this sepia shade from Vallejo to that. And right here, I feel like that's not got enough definition. Like all the feathers are just too compressed in that light. So let's see what I'm doing, just like I did to the amber. Just did that, and then all of a sudden now that headdress starts to take shape, I think, a little bit more. But what we put down was, because it was essentially a couple of washes, it's still transparent enough to let the light show through. It's not going to completely, it's not like black lining. You know, black lining is, well, it's, we're using black paint. This is not black lining because look at how transparent that is. I'm going to go into, see this shadow area right here? I want that to turn a little more. That's the other, you have to sometimes create that turn. It's weird, even though it's 3 dimensions. You would think you wouldn't need to do that, but I think everything is just so tiny. It's such a small scale that sometimes you just have to force that issue. This top edge to me needs a little, there we go. Just it was lacking in some shape. It was all light. Everything was light here. When I left that light over there mostly intact. I tone this down. I think this needs similar thing, especially down here. Down there. Needed to be toned down a little bit. The next thing we'll play around with is the amber up here. So to complete this little amber stone that's up here at the top of the staff, just thought I'd bring this out. I've got a few colors out here. This is the GW Vomit Brown. And essentially the idea is, it's got some of this dark, or some of the sepia shade, some of the ruby, what we're trying to do is see how this kind of goes dark down into light. Like this. See, we got about this much set up. This is about where we're at right now. This is around what's on the miniature. Well, obviously we want to lighten that. So we've got, we're actually going to add some of the yellow too. A little more intensity to this. And work down here, work up here, work over here. I don't want this to get too yellow, so I want to make sure that this still gets mixed in with that vomit brown. So that's about the extent of what we do with just the yellow. Then we throw some of the ice yellow out on the palette. Put that in to our mix. And just like any gemstone, although these are not going to be really the same kind of hard facets you might see on some other types of gemstones. So there we go. And last but not least, some brighter highlights in. If you feel that's not quite dark enough, you can go in and solidify a few darks. So this is what we want for your gemstone. So we've got most of the darks in there. Let's make sure that we have enough of the vomit brown out on the palette. So we've got plenty of the dark. What we need to do is bring back a little bit of the light. There's a few more facets on this than there was on our sketch, which is fine. It's all about these dark to light transitions now. Get a little bit of the yellow into that vomit brown. Trying to create these dark on the top, light on the bottom transitions. Start to work some of that ice yellow into our mix. And then after this, what I'm going to do is take this off of my dowel rod, put it on the base. See what the whole thing kind of looks like together. And while I'm in the area, I see that I want to do a few little scattered lights here and there. So this little piece right here, it needs to be, definitely needs to be darker. Right here. Not quite as dark as everything else, but definitely a little bit darker. Back to some of these lighter colors. There we go. And really the whole point of this is to show you what all of these range of yellows can get you here. So our grayed down colors got more intense, and all of this, it's all in the yellows, complemented by our purple in the flesh tone on the base. You can see our lights and darks, how they worked its way through each set of the colors. And hopefully when you do this, you'll be able to get as much range out of your yellows as I did here. When you're working on your miniatures, if they're for a competition, for gold demons, crystal brush, whatever, you'll probably spend many hours more than I did here. But the whole point of this was just to give you a general idea of what can be done with the yellows. How far you can push just one color, how you can complement it.
rock your brain. Fancy dress or in your darkest vest. Well, here is the place where you can join the rest.